right, so today we begin a new study. Actually, we're going to be looking at Exodus and Leviticus, a little bit of Leviticus. Excuse me. So, giving a little bit of background, because the lesson actually jumps right in the middle of a lot of things that are happening. So, prior to what we're going to be looking at today, two major things happen. Number one, Joseph. You remember Joseph took his family descendants to Egypt because there was a famine in Canaan, and so he took his clan, if you will, took them to Egypt to have relief from the famine. All the story of Joseph we've talked about before. He was a part of Pharaoh. He was really trusted with a Pharaoh. I'm going to say a Pharaoh because the Pharaoh we're going to be looking at here is different than the one Joseph was under. And so Joseph and his descendants enjoyed. They were in the land. They settled in the land of Goshen, which was a very fertile area in and around Egypt, and they enjoyed. They were not enslaved, but they enjoyed a relative degree of prosperity in that land. What we're going to be talking about takes place in and around 1250 BC. The Pharaoh was Ramses II. And so there's major events that are taking place here. Number one is Joseph died. Okay, so all of the influence that Joseph had with Pharaoh and the Egyptian people, that went by the wayside. Now, in Exodus chapter 1, verse 8, there's an interesting verse there. If you're not careful, you'll just kind of pass over it. And it seems kind of like a benign statement, but it has full significance. Verse 8 says, "And a new king," or a new Pharaoh, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. Now, the reason that that's significant is that he didn't care anything about what Joseph had done, Joseph's heritage, Joseph's influence. He didn't care anything about that. In fact, this new Pharaoh, became paranoid because the Jewish people, the descendants of Abraham, they began to increase in number, and so this Pharaoh became paranoid about that. It's like they were overtaking the Egyptian population. Oh, we can't have that. So a leader who cares nothing about Joseph, all that he had done, and is paranoid about the Israelites increasing in number, became paranoid about that. If you recall, then there was an order that was sent out from Pharaoh to kill all the male children. Something significant happens, which I believe was God inspired. God injected himself into human events. Moses' mother put him in the old story, put him in the little basket, sending down the Nile. He ended up in Pharaoh's household, grew up under Pharaoh's tutelage, became well respected and everybody thought of him as being Egyptian, until things got so bad, so abusive with the Egyptians upon the Israelites, that at one point Moses stepped in, murdered one of the taskmasters, and then fled. Okay, he ended up under Jethro's keeping his flock. He became a shepherd on the backside of Midian. And there he was for, I think it was like 40, it was a long time. Now, why is all that significant? And this is before we get into anything. Why is that significant? It shows, it shows how God, remember I've talked in other lessons how God is always moving back here in the background? None of this stuff happens, none of these events happen without God directing them to happen. Even though there was an evil Pharaoh that arose and really began enslaving, this is where the slavery started, began enslaving the Israelite people, God was using that. Okay? Here's Moses. He was saved from death. We look at, and we'll look at it a little bit here in this lesson, that God calling Moses out of a burning bush. That wasn't where, it didn't just start there. It started way back with his birth and with him being saved by his mom putting him in a basket and sending him down the river. It began back there. So God was engineering human events. You've heard me talk about this before. He was engineering human events in order to fulfill his redemptive purpose. So as we begin to open up Exodus and we begin to look at it, you're going to see, and I'll draw parallels between what's going on with the Israelites and what happens with us today. So I'll be all through our study, I'll be drawing those distinctions, what's happening here and then what's happening with us today. Okay? So with all of that, by the way, let me just say this. So what was I think I said Jethro. What was Moses doing on the backside of the desert? He was becoming a shepherd. So he went from the prestige of Pharaoh's household, Pharaoh's palace, and now he's a shepherd. God is working in the background. Moses is going to be dealing with stubborn people all along the way. And so he's grooming him, if I could say it that way. He's growing him into the place where he's going to become more useful. Okay? So with all that said, let's get into the lesson here. Number one, Herd, chapter 2, verses 23 to 25. Someone read that?
During that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out. And their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them.
Okay. So there's some things I want to point out here. Excuse me. After a long time, so he's talking about there. Oh, by the way, I should have said this earlier. Moses is the one that's credited as the author of what we call the Pentateuch. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Those 5 books of the Bible. And when you hear about, later on in the Old Testament, and then in some points in the New Testament, you hear about the law of Moses. It's referring to what some people call the Torah. Other people refer to it as the Pentateuch, those first 5 books. That's the law of Moses. Okay?
Isn't that what the Jewish folks still use today?
Yes, it is. And they call it now, they call it the Torah. Yeah. So after a long time, so he's talking about this change in, so he's setting the scene, the change in pharaohs. which means a change in status for the Israelite people. After a long time, the king of Egypt died. Okay? Now, notice the next phrase. The Israelites groaned because of their difficult labor, and they cried out, and their cry for help, because of the difficult labor ascended to God. I'm sorry. That word groan. So, have you ever heard someone, or maybe you've experienced it yourself, or a family member, that has the loss of a loved one is so deep that they groan. They audibly groan. Okay? So this word groan is an important word because it tells us that at this point, it's been 450 years of bondage here. Okay? Was it 40 generations? The generation is 10 years, right? 20? So whatever that is. So 20 generations, I guess. My math is not good.
Right.
Am I right? Yeah. Ooh, off the top of my head there. It's pretty good. The Israelites groaned because of their difficulty.
Well, don't you think they groaned because they couldn't really express it? How can you express such deep pain and sorrow? And I mean, you can say stuff, but that doesn't. Yeah,
I mean, Joseph is gone. The Pharaoh who favored them was gone. This Pharaoh was hostile towards them, killing all of the male children. They had reason to groan. Can you imagine, I've had some jobs, and I'm sure you have too, that after a while, they're just boring as all get out. I remember working in a couple of factories right after high school, and you did the same thing day after day after day. It was the same thing. You could almost do it in your sleep. Okay. Can you imagine for generations, your children, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren, and your great-great-grandchildren all did the same thing. What they do, they got up in the morning, they went to the mud pits, clay pits, and they made bricks. They went home, they slept, they got up again, and they were forced. It wasn't, I mean, they didn't get paid for it, they were enslaved. Okay? So when it says the Israelite groaned because of the difficult labor, it got worse and worse and worse and worse. And they cried out. Well, who'd they cry out to? Well, we know him as God. They did. This was they referred to him as the one who has no name. Okay. They didn't know who he was. They just knew that he existed. God did not reveal himself and give a name, even to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He didn't give his name. They just knew that this deity existed. Okay. They cried for help. When, I think I stated it last week, I want to state it again here. When someone, this time of year is not, for many, many people, is not a happy time of year. This is the time of year where depression spikes and where suicides spike. Where
the elderly die.
And the elderly die. Yeah. Wintertime is just a hard time of year. And the holiday season, and really what I call holiday season, is anywhere from November 1 to January 31. Okay, that time span. There are people who They have no family either here local or they have no family. There are people nowadays who are estranged from their family, who cannot, and they've chosen. I remember mentioning was a couple of weeks ago, this 4B movement that's going on, that there are people who, because if a family member, they found out that a family member voted for Trump, they were disinvited to Thanksgiving meal. Okay?
Well, and we've got so many people who've lost loved ones, and nobody should have to bury a child, but we all know somebody within this last year who has lost a child.
Yeah.
And so I can't imagine what all of the holidays would be like
Yeah.
losing a child.
I call it, it's just something I call it in those instances, I call it a year of firsts. Once you get past the year of firsts, it becomes a little easier. Doesn't become easy, but it becomes a little easier. And what I mean by the first is, the first Thanksgiving, the first Christmas, the first New Year's, the first anniversary, the first birthday, all those firsts. Once you get by those, it gets a little easier. Okay?
Jim, I worked for a large funeral home in St. Louis years ago, doing a little job for them, and I noticed it was about this time of year, and we left there on Friday, and they had 4 or 5 bodies laying there. When I got in there Monday morning, they had 20 some odd bodies laying there. And I asked, it's an old time funeral director down there, his name is Harley. I said, well, what, do you have a massacre or what? He said, no, this is our busy season. I said, how do you have a busy season? He said, the holiday season and the first snow.
Yep.
He said, people give up.
Yep.
They don't want to face it, they give up, and he said, they'll just die.
Yeah.
And those 3 years, that happens.
And thinking back what you said there, thinking back to 2020 when COVID hit, and people in nursing homes or residential care facilities could not see their family. Okay, they were, because of whatever precautions, they were not allowed to, and people in those nursing homes, and it's documented, people in the nursing homes and residential care facilities, when they did not have, for those months on end, did not have that family contact, they could talk to them on the phone. It got to where if you had somebody in ICU, you could not go visit them. Two things there really stand out. Number one is that all of us need that human touch. We need, God created us that way.
Well, that's when you start having your heart troubles.
Yeah.
And I had to just drop you off at the doctor's office and wait outside.
Yeah.
And whenever you had your stent, you didn't get a stent, but the cardiac cath, we had to drop you off outside. And I sat out there, because the doctor was sure he's going to have open heart surgery. And I sat outside and wondered. And JD was with me, and Jim's sister. But I kept wondering, if he has to go to St. Louis, do I drive to St. Louis and sit in the parking lot, or do I just go home and wait for a phone call?
Really?
It was a horrible time.
Yeah. And so think about that in terms of what they're going through, generation after generation. This is what their plight was. Okay, so now watch, and their cry for help because of the difficult labor ascended to God. So they were, even at this time.